Hello, everyone, and welcome to our What Inclusive Instructors Do author webinar. My name is Patty Webb, and I am the Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and their latest titles. Today, I'm happy to introduce authors Tracie Addy, Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning at Lafayette College, Derek Dube, Associate Professor of Biology at the University of St. Joseph's, Connecticut, Khadijah Mitchell, Assistant Professor of Biology, and Peter C.S. Dobermont, MD Scholar of Health and Life Sciences at Lafayette College, and Mallory SoRelle, an Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Their book, What Inclusive Instructors Do, Principles and Practices for Excellence in College Teaching, was released this last week by Stylus Publishing. The authors surveyed hundreds of instructors as part of a national study to define what inclusive teaching meant to them and what inclusive teaching approaches they implemented in their courses. During this webinar, they will discuss small steps instructors can take to foster more inclusive classrooms based on the findings of that study. So welcome everyone, and panelists, take it away.
Thank you so much, Patty. So it's really great to see everybody here, and I'm really encouraged by the diversity of institutions and everyone who's connecting with us today. So thank you so much for being here. I'm very delighted to start off our conversation today. And basically, we're going to have various things we'll talk about. So just to give you a sense of how we'll set up our webinar, first, we're going to introduce ourselves. And Patty gave a really nice introduction. And we'll talk about ourselves in a little bit more. And then we'll talk about why did we write this book? You know, were we crazy? No, we weren't crazy. We wrote it for some good reasons, and we hope that everybody benefits from the book. We'll give you some highlights, so those small steps that Patty talked about, just so that you can get a feel of what's in the book. And then, as Patty mentioned as well, we'll have time for Q&A. So please do put any questions into the Q&A area, and we'll look at them and talk about them then. So I'm going to start off introducing myself. So Tracie Addy, and as Patty mentioned, I'm Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning at Lafayette College. So what does that mean? Well, basically means I work as an educational developer, and I work with faculty and instructors across ranks, across disciplines, and I partner with them on their teaching efforts. At my center, which I direct, I'm very, we have a lot of focuses on inclusion, on inclusive teaching. We've done a number of initiatives and we continue to do them. Many of you at your own institutions are probably thinking about these issues as well. And I think that's why also you're here today. So that's basically my introduction, and we'll talk in a little bit about why we wrote the book. So I'm going to pass the baton to Derek.
Hello, everyone. I'm Derek Dube. I am an associate professor of biology at the University of St. Joseph, which is in Connecticut. I did my training, my PhD training at the University of Virginia, and then a postdoctoral research program at the University of Michigan before joining the University of St. Joseph. In addition to my role as an instructor here, I also serve as the director for our Center for Student Research and Creative Activities, which we think fits really nicely into this idea of inclusivity and how we engage with our students across diverse backgrounds and things like that. I'm excited to be here with you guys today, and we'll pass it over to Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you so much, Derek. Hi, everyone. My name is Khadijah Mitchell. I'm an assistant professor of biology at Lafayette College, and I spend a lot of time thinking not only about inclusive teaching, but also including my research into my teaching. So I was really excited to embark on an endeavor like this. So I am particularly a STEM professor, and I focus on genetics. And so I use a lot of inclusive teaching pedagogies and practices and incorporate them not only in my research lab, but also in my teaching laboratory. And just by way of training, I'm originally from Pittsburgh. So I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Pittsburgh, my master's degree at Duquesne University, and my PhD at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And along the way in all of my training, I pursued certificates in teaching. And so this is the natural progression as a professor that I'm able to apply the theoretical things I learned into this context. I'll pass this on to Dr. SoRelle.
Thanks, Khadijah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mallory SoRelle. I'm an assistant professor at the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Prior to this, I spent 4 years with my wonderful colleagues, Tracie and Khadijah at Lafayette College on the faculty there. I am I think the lone social scientist of the group. So most of my research focuses on inequalities in American politics and American public policy. So I spend a lot of time studying structures of inequality in our political life. But I found my way into thinking about sort of inclusive teaching practices really in grad school. I did my PhD at Cornell and started running TA training and professionalization for the grad students in my department there, and did that for about 4 years. Once I got to Lafayette, I ended up doing some workshops on course design for new faculty orientation and some other things like that. So that's sort of how inclusive teaching found its way into my sort of professional portfolio.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. So the next thing we want to talk about is a little bit about why did we actually write the book. I'm actually going to go back for a minute here. Excuse me. And so we want to talk a little bit about the book at first. So the book is a progression, I would say. We were designing the book, as mentioned a little bit earlier, to think about the theory as well as the practice of thinking about inclusive teaching. And the book is basically outlined in that way. You'll see in the first couple of chapters, we focus on frameworks and mindsets. And then we really go deep into practices. And we also present a tool called the Who's in Class form, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then we also go into the culture. How do you establish or think about establishing a culture of inclusive teaching? So this book really traverses a lot of different aspects of inclusion. It's meant to be a more comprehensive resource and a resource for instructors, for educational developers, for administrators who are really thinking about this thing called inclusive teaching. So why did we write the book? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about, my story. I will say that a primary motivation, a driving factor, was definitely the study that Patty mentioned. So we did do a survey of a lot of, instructors across various disciplines, different institution types, and you'll see that the voices of those instructors emerge from the book. And we basically found some really interesting things. This was a multi-part study, and one part of the study was really focused on what predicts whether instructors adopt inclusive teaching practices. So it's a quantitative analysis, and that paper, that article, and that research will come out in To Improve the Academy soon. So hopefully, if you go to that journal in the coming months, you'll be able to see that particular research. But what really primed the book was really thinking about the voices and what did instructors actually say they do. So what did the inclusive instructors say they do in their classrooms that make it inclusive, and taking that, thinking about the themes and disentangling it and pulling it into a book. So originally, I hadn't been thinking about, let's pull this all into a book, but because looking at the data was so rich and it was so useful, and it would actually help we have the research there, but we also would really want some really strategies and practices and theory around teaching. And I thought that this would be a great thing. And so I did ask my co-authors if they would like to write, this book, and they agreed. So I thank them for doing that. And also, thinking about inclusion, it's just so critical these days. To me, inclusive teaching is excellent teaching. We should all be inclusive in our classrooms. And how wonderful to basically have a resource that actually helps us really think deeply about this. You'll see also the book has reflection and built in. There's reflective questions in every section, in every chapter. So it's really encouraging instructors to really reflect upon their teaching. So those are some of my motivations. I could say more, but I'm going to pass the baton and let my co-authors also share.
Yeah, so I'll echo a lot of what Tracie mentioned there. There were a number of reasons why I involved myself in writing the book, and some of it was a little bit selfish, to be honest, to give myself a dedicated time to reflect and thoughtfully consider and absorb the current research on and perspectives around inclusive teaching in higher education, because I thought that this might help my own teaching and my ability to connect with my own students. But in a bigger picture, I really wanted, again, to write this book to be a resource to help others that are on their own journeys as educators. Because I know myself, you know, coming into higher ed as an instructor, I'm a white male from a middle-class family. I have my own perspectives and background and biases that are both subconscious and conscious. And it took me a while to appreciate the diversity of experience that every single classroom holds and how that can really be an asset for the learning that occurs within and then outside of that classroom. So I wanted to be a part of this book to help others find ways to unlock that strength, that power in the classroom that comes through, including everyone in that learning community. And that's why I was happy to be a part of this group and in writing this book.
So similar to what both Tracie and Derek said, my desire to co-author the book, it really stemmed from selfish reasons. I guess also I echo some things that Derek said from my own higher education experiences. And so I identify as a first-generation college student, as a scholar of color, and a cisgendered Black woman in STEM. And I thought about how those experiences shaped my own pedagogy as a professor. And while we were carrying out the survey, I learned a lot of great strategies from the inclusive instructors around the country, and I was able to apply them in my own classroom. And I thought, you know, wow, this will be a really great opportunity with the book to share these wonderful principles and practices with others. And so that, you know, with the aspiration that this would be the go-to resource for inclusive teaching, and it would be independent of institution type, because I trained at various types of institutions. And I think there's some commonality, like Tracie mentioned, inclusive teaching is good teaching, and that's independent of institution type and also independent of STEM. So similar to with Mallory shared, it doesn't matter if we all were STEM or not, right? So that was one of the reasons why I was really excited to write the book.
Yeah, I'm going to build on something Khadijah was just talking about. You know, when I think about my own evolution as a teacher, it has been sort of fundamentally shaped by the ability to learn from others, right? To learn from others' successes, to learn from others' failures. And I can't imagine my own teaching today without being able to benefit, right, from the experiences of others. That was true as a grad student when I was first starting out and first in the classroom. And it's been especially true, you know, this year, as we've all been trying to sort of figure out on the fly how to teach in this pandemic when we've predominantly been online, particularly for folks who've never done that before, when our students are approaching their classes in ways that they've not had to grapple with before. And being able to share you know, successes and failures with other faculty who are going through something similar has been truly invaluable. And so for me, writing this book is not just the opportunity to sort of put together a book that I would have really loved to have had when I was starting out, right? That does kind of walk you through some of the questions you want to be asking about how to be an inclusive teacher, but also the opportunity to learn from others' insights, to see what other people are doing, and figure out how to incorporate that kind of wisdom into my own teaching. So that really was the motivation for me.
All right, thank you all. So next we're going to transition into talking about the book. So we're going to choose, and we basically chose a few highlights of the book to kind of give you a sense of what's in it. The first thing I want to start with, though, is a quote. This is what emerges again throughout the book. You'll see a bunch of quotes and voices of instructors who participated in our study from various institutions across disciplines and across ranks. So if you look at this particular quote, this instructor says, "I go about this," you know, this is inclusive teaching, "by generating activities throughout the semester to find out more about my student audience, their interests, their career interests, their misconceptions about different topics, how their cultural, geographic, and generational experiences inform their own interests, perceptions of future career goals, and self-evaluation." Okay, so one of the first areas in the book digs into thinking about not just the research, but also the mindsets of inclusive instructors. And we believe that this was really important to put in the book because it's really from the mindset that flows these strategies. Like we could give a bunch of different strategies, but what we really want to do is to really have a framework when we teach that is inclusive. So in the book, you'll see in around chapter 2, a bunch of different ways in which we've characterized the mindsets of inclusive instructors. Here, I'm going to present just 3 of those categories and talk a little bit about them. So the first one listed, they know that understanding who their students are is critical to advancing learning. So what we saw emerge greatly, and as you saw in the quote prior, is that these instructors who are inclusive really want to know their students. They want to know about their social identities. They want to know about, what do they know about the course material? They want to know what makes them anxious, etc. They want to know their students. One of the areas in which we focused on, especially in my center and with some of my collaborators as well, some here on this call, is the who's in class form. And that's actually presented later in the book. And we're not going to present a separate area there, but it's around chapter 6 in the book. And that form is a form that actually focuses on knowing who students are. That's why it's called the who's in class form. So we've done some work around that form. And we've done some research and we're hoping it will be published soon. It's under review. But that form is basically a form where an instructor basically asks students, and they're welcome to respond. They don't have to, it's anonymous. This particular form, we designed it with students, faculty and staff as well. We got lots of input on it. And then we actually implemented it as well. And we got perceptions of both students and the instructors and their feedback on the form. And that particular form focuses on things like, students' social identities, or, if they're a first-gen student, if they can afford course materials, things like that. And again, it's anonymous, they can choose, it's voluntary. Even though it was voluntary, we had really good response rates from students using the actual form. So that was a way, and that is a way that inclusive instructors are actually going about understanding who their students are. They're doing some kind of surveys, or like the quote, they're actually thinking about designing activities specifically to get to know students, having office hours, etc. But they're very curious, and they know that that is going to make an effective learning environment by knowing what their students bring. So that's the first point. The second mindset we saw that was very clear is that they consider student diversity an asset and not a deficit. So some of us may have heard of the student deficit model, which is not the model that we like to prescribe to in higher education. And that's basically, saying that students come in with all these weaknesses, et cetera, and, focusing kind of on that kind of negative kind of feel. But what we're really thinking about here, and what we see for inclusive instructors, is that they're excited about the diversity of their class and they want to know who their students are. They're also thrilled that they actually have a lot of diversity, and they're thinking very carefully about how to create supports in the classroom to make an equitable experience in the classroom so that all students can have the potential to succeed in their classes. So diversity as an asset was another mindset. And the third one that I want to talk about today is the fact of ownership. They take ownership over fostering an inclusive learning environment. From the study that we did that will soon be published, we also asked instructors kind of what are the barriers or challenges that are faced? Like, why aren't people doing inclusive instruction, right? What's going on here? And one of the things that came out was they thought it was not my job. It's not my responsibility to create an inclusive environment. Maybe it's the Office of Diversity or other offices, around their institution, but it's really not my job in my classroom. This is a very different dynamic that we see for those instructors who are inclusive. The instructors who are inclusive, they take ownership. They say, actually, no, it is my responsibility to foster an inclusive learning environment the best ways that I can, do that. And they also have a growth mindset, right? So sometimes, people make mistakes and they're not going to be perfect, but that's another mindset that inclusive instructors also espoused. So you'll see a lot more discussed in the book as well around mindset, around different frameworks also for inclusion, and also around the research for inclusion. And that now primes what we're going to get into next, which is really thinking about the practices of inclusive teaching.
So thanks, Tracie. So when we think about the practice of inclusive teaching, I think we start in the book, as I think most of us do in real life, with course design, and particularly how that manifests in a syllabus, right? And we talk about the syllabus as a really important place to start, not only because it's an opportunity for us as instructors to really articulate what our goals are for students, and to assess all of the moving parts of the course, right? And start to think about how all of those moving parts are contributing, or potentially not contributing to an inclusive classroom. But it's also important because the syllabus is a tone setter for the class. It is very frequently the first point of contact that an instructor will have with students. And so it's going to begin to set student expectations for what this class is going to look like that they're about to go into. And if we want to promote an inclusive classroom, right, we hopefully want to have a syllabus that conveys that is our goal, or one of our goals. And so we can see from this quote here, right, this idea that we're rewriting our syllabus to be more inclusive, perhaps by including things like a section on how to get help, a section on how to go about making use of office hours, and just generally demystifying many aspects of the syllabus. So this is an example of a strategy that instructors mention that help us achieve sort of one of two things that we talk a lot about in the book. We talk about inclusive teaching as teaching that promotes belonging and teaching that promotes equity. And so in chapter 3, we think a lot about how the syllabus in particular and the course design can go about promoting belonging and equity. And we try to answer that around 3 general themes. So Tracie, you want to head to the next slide? So in this chapter, we break down the ideas of promoting belonging and equity into 3 different sort of broad strategies. The first is to demonstrate that students belong in the field. And so we can think about this as belonging in the classroom, right? But also belonging in the larger sort of substantive, scholarly, or professional field that the class relates to. And so we talk about strategies, some that many of you are probably familiar with, things like trying to assign more diverse readings. But we also talk about some other tools that scholars use, focusing on particularly relevant readings for different communities in the classroom. Focus on demonstrating belonging by incorporating different types of media that some folks may be more or less familiar with, right? And other ways of demonstrating belonging in a field. Then we talk about encouraging equitable participation in the learning process. And we think about this as both helping to promote belonging, but also helping to promote sort of equity in the chances that people will succeed in the course. So in this section of the chapter, we talk about things like how to generate sort of equitable participation in the course, demonstrating to students through a syllabus what that actually looks like. But we also talk about things like laying out the sort of expectations, not only that instructors have of students, but also, and importantly, expectations that students ought to have for one another and also for the instructor, right? So what do instructors owe to students in a particular course? And we talk about that as a way of creating a really equitable community where everyone feels like there is some give and take, right? Sort of among all the actors in the classroom. And then finally in this chapter, we talk about promoting conditions for every student to succeed, right? Because if you want an equitable course, presumably that means that everyone has sort of an equal chance of doing well in the course. And so we talk particularly about the need through the syllabus to explain not only what students are doing, right? I think most of us understand that's something we're doing in a syllabus, but also how they can be successful in doing that. So for example, if you're telling students to read something and take notes, giving them a little bit of information on how to actually go about doing that, right? What should they be looking for? What should they be making note of? If you tell students something about an assignment, perhaps you give them resources for how they can get assistance with elements of that assignment if they need that. So what and how? And then crucially, and I think this is the point that folks often miss in course design, is why. Why are you asking students to do these things? If we think back to that quote about demystifying the syllabus, a lot of what we talk about in this chapter is providing rationales for things, with the expectation that most of the students in our courses aren't familiar with the sort of norms of higher education, and that there are going to be some inequalities in that familiarity. One of our goals is to tell students why we're asking them to do the things we're asking. Why would you go to office hours? Why is my grading policy this and not something else? Why am I asking you to do this particular assignment? On the assumption that students are going to be much more likely to succeed, not only when they know what you want them to do, but when they understand why you're asking them to do that thing. And so throughout the chapter, we bring in a lot of the language from these surveys, from what other instructors are doing. We bridge that with sort of theory around each of these points, and we provide some pretty explicit sort of how-to, some questions to ask as you're designing your syllabus, some elements you might want to include, some language around some of these different pieces of the syllabus. And then finally, we end with a discussion of the challenges that we all face in creating inclusive course designs and inclusive syllabi. And we provide some potential resources for folks to consider as they're trying to navigate those challenges.
So I am going to start with thinking about facilitating inclusive learning environments. And so chapter 4 focuses on this. It was a great follow-up to what Mallory just shared with us about inclusive syllabus design. So one of the inclusive instructors we surveyed highlighted, and we also highlight in the book, shared this really great quote about how they facilitate an inclusive learning environment. And it had a particular emphasis on timing. And so although the quote comes from someone who teaches online, I think that's a great strength and power of our book. It's great for instructors who are teaching online, in person, or hybrid courses, but the same sentiment exists in all types of classrooms. So it says, my examples all refer to online teaching. Provide a welcome statement with a positive tone, provide many resources for students who may have technical difficulties, welcome alternate views in the online discussions, course ground rules for discussions, a safe environment. And this in particular was an adjunct professor at a doctoral granting university in the discipline of psychology. So the key message is that we saw throughout the book, and you will see, is that inclusive instructors create a welcoming classroom at any time during the instruction. And this may be a little radical for some of us because we think about when we're actually in the presence of the students. But in fact, inclusive instructors we saw across the country thought about before a course starts, at the beginning of a course, throughout a course, and even at the end of a course. So inclusive instructors who teach face-to-face, we saw online and hybrid courses, recognize that timing is a valuable tool. And so with this in mind, they have strategies that make the students feel welcome. So whether it's before the course starts, the first day, the first week, or any other time throughout the course. And in essence, they know it's never too late. So when we're thinking about before course start, they set a positive and welcoming tone. So this was across various inclusive instructors. And the way that many of them accomplished this was through welcome statements, but not just that, also welcome videos and emails, like the opening quote mentioned. And some instructors actually solicited student feedback and shared some things about themselves. So this two-way communication was very interesting and key. And there are several examples of that throughout the chapter. And you can think about this as a greeting card before the start of a course. So there are expectations similar to what Mallory said, like the syllabus, but then they're actually getting the first contact with you even before course starts. So at the beginning of a course, and we typically think that's in the first couple class sessions, we saw that the inclusive instructors really were intentional about building community. So that was community with the instructor and the students, but also helping to build classroom community amongst the students, right? So thinking about how they put students in groups, thinking about the types of questions and things that they learn from the students, and making sure that they maintain that welcoming environment. So it wasn't that they just started with the first 2 class sessions and then decided to just let it take its course. They actually were very intentional about maintaining that welcoming environment. So a lot of them use student information surveys. So this echoes what Tracie mentioned about the Who's in Class form, which is in chapter 6 of our book. So those type of student information surveys, they help you learn about the student, but in particular, thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we often put these 3 together, but when we're thinking about a sense of belonging, definitely the inclusion part becomes key. And so we saw that the instructors in maintaining the welcome environment leveraged that knowledge, right? So that they can help promote belonging. So it really allowed them to tailor the experience in thinking of how to welcome the individual students to who was in the room. So instead of this blanket approach, it allowed for a lot of fine tuning for the students that were in that particular course. And then finally, thinking about even the last day, which is very interesting, a lot of inclusive instructors talked about how they created this welcoming environment even at the end. And so on the last day of class, for example, some instructors talked about highlighting how much the students have learned, so their journey, but also thanking the students for how much the instructor learned from them. And so really sharing this space and letting them know that they really are a part of that learning community made many students feel welcome. So instructors employed that strategy. And this also affirmed the students' abilities and encouraged them to see themselves as members of the particular community of practices. So several instructors commented on that. And having the inclusive instructors have the students wrap up and reflect and think about how they felt in their belonging and welcoming in the classroom. And so why that is really important, even on the last day of class, is because that was shown across several instructors to help future classrooms become more inviting.
So in chapter 5 of the book, and kind of the next section that I'm going to talk about a little bit, is where we dive into the inclusive teaching strategies that inclusive instructors implement. So what are they actually doing in the classroom to apply this? And this really sits on the foundation of all the things my colleagues mentioned and all the things we learned from our national survey of instructors. You know, the principles of, you know, having a growth mindset and valuing diversity as an asset, acquiring and implementing student feedback, creating that welcoming classroom, and having a student-centered classroom are all integral to actually then using inclusive strategies in the classroom to advance the learning of whatever the content you're focusing on in that class is. This quote that came from an adjunct instructor at a master's college in psychology, I thought did a pretty nice job of touching on many of the aspects and really transitioning from some of those things my colleagues said into the what am I doing on Wednesday in the classroom, right? So inclusive teaching is creating a welcoming classroom environment for all students, having high expectation with support for students who need it to be successful, differentiating content presentation and learning activities, and options for demonstrating mastery. And this is important, especially where they mention having high expectations, because one of the things you'll hear sometimes is, if I need my class to be equitable and everybody's coming in with these different backgrounds, how can I maintain high expectations? Well, the fact of the matter is you can. And in fact, if you're teaching inclusively, you're going to have that benefit and those high expectations for all. You're just finding ways so that your student learning community can reach those high expectations. So you can go ahead and advance the slide, Tracie. In this chapter, we talk about a number of different things, but really 3 kind of major areas. First of all, the instructors in the classroom, whether that's a virtual classroom or an in-person classroom or a hybrid version, they engage with students in an inclusive manner. And this gets to what Khadijah was mentioning a bit in terms of the role of the instructor, not so much as a, a sage on the stage, as they say, but more as a participatory member of that learning community, more of a trail guide in some ways to learning. Being transparent, which were things that I believe Mallory was mentioning, the why we're doing what we're doing. So not just from a whole course perspective, but on a given day, today we're going to learn in this way. Why are we going to do that? Why was that choice made? Implementing things like universal design for learning, and even things in terms of how do we call on students? Do we call on students? How are students invited to participate in the classroom learning? Further, they use intentionally inclusive pedagogies that maybe have some research behind them as supporting not just one particular subset of students, but rather a broader subset, and potentially narrowing achievement gaps that have been seen historically in higher education. And I'm going to circle back to this in a minute and spend a little more time on the inclusive pedagogies that many instructors have used. And then they assess inclusively. And this is another thing that this chapter talks a bit about. How do we actually go about assessing our student learning, and what options do we have? And this can range from, whether we have timed exams or not, what kind of format and style of questions we implement, whether we have to have exams or whether there's other alternatives to having exams, and even broadly, do we have to have grades? Are grades a necessary thing? And depending on what institution you're at, the answer there might be a little bit different. It might be absolutely, I have to have grades, I've been told so. Or there's institutions that are going away from grading entirely. And what's kind of the information in the fallout of that is something that the chapter gets into a little bit as well. But circling back to the inclusive pedagogies they use. So what are some of these things? Well, one of the big take-home messages is that research supports that using multiple learning modalities can be really beneficial for all students. And in both increased achievement outcomes, as well as confidence and attitudes and engagement in the learning process. So not just sticking to one type of pedagogy an entire semester long or an entire course long seems to have benefits. Additionally, thinking about how you structure the class. So there's been a lot of work done. Kimberly Tanner's an individual who's talked about and done research and published on kind of course structure, and Hogan et al. As well. In thinking about structure in terms of, again, is it didactic lecture? Is it more active learning? Is it somewhere in between? And other aspects that constitute kind of how you structure the course. And finding that things like increased student engagement times of more than 40% of a class time being devoted to student engagement activities leads to increased learning outcomes for all groups, but disproportionately is beneficial for those that have had achievement gaps before. In the 2014 Hogan study, it was for Black and first generation students, close those gaps. So if you're kind of looking to use more inclusive pedagogies, and specifically ones that allow for student engagement, high levels of student engagement, we're often talking about active learning is kind of the buzzword that we go there. But what is active learning? Well, the book in the chapter specifically gets into a number of different practices that can be used, things from problem-based learning to case studies, classroom jigsaws to debates, POGIL, serious gaming, how does that play a role? Even doing things that have historically been involved in higher ed and other classroom learning, like debates. That can be a great way to involve active learning and get student engagement, but also as simple as doing things like think, pair, share, right? So giving students time to think about a question or a topic, come up with kind of their own thoughts, pair up in small groups, maybe just with one other student, share that out each other, talk about it, and then maybe bring that to the larger group and start that discussion. So there's lots of different ways that have been shown to be beneficial and inclusive. The book gets into it a little bit. I recommend you check that out. And also, of course, feel free to ask questions as we move forward into the Q&A section of today's presentation.
Thank you, everybody. So we are now, as Derek mentioned, going to move into the Q&A. I do see we have some questions already. So maybe what I can do, I can basically read off some of them, and then some of the members of my co-authors can also answer them as well. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. There is a question I do see in the chat. How did you decide that the instructors you spoke to were in fact inclusive? Okay, so that's a great question. So for the survey, we could identify who was inclusive basically by the inclusive behaviors that they shared. So we asked them, you know, what types of inclusive teaching behaviors they shared. If they weren't unable to, you know, then they would say, I don't know, or I don't do this, or I don't understand, or they would actually share various inclusive teaching behaviors. And so those quotes that we brought out do kind of bring out those types of instructors as well. So that's a great question.
Yeah, and I would mention that we also, you know, in writing this book, we have our own experiences with teaching and with trying to be inclusive, but really the idea was it not to just be us talking about this is inclusive teaching, right? Mm-hmm. But using those voices, but also supporting that with the research that's out there. So another way that we kind of looked for, you know, are these instructors inclusive? Is it supported by the research that exists as well?
Yeah, that's a good point, Derek. We were looking for lots of connections there, and they were there. You know, we could also see those connections. It became very clear. I see another question in the chat. You mentioned that a paper is in press. Can you give us an idea on top challenges and strategies to promote adoption of DEI student-centered practices? So yeah, that paper gets into predictions of what makes or what factors, you know, predict whether or not an instructor is going to, you know, use inclusive teaching approaches, as well as the barriers and challenges faced. So and some of my co-authors I think are here, like Derek and Khadijah, so you can comment upon this too. But some of the barriers, I described a few of them, not thinking it's their responsibility, not being aware of inclusive teaching practices, so not even knowing where to start. And that's another reason for writing this type of book, is because, and I think Mallory said this too, when we start out with teaching, wouldn't it be great to have a resource like this, right? So that we can actually help be more aware of what types of strategies are inclusive and base it on what we know, what the literature says, etc. So that was a major barrier that was definitely there. Not thinking it was their responsibility, not having time, not having resources. All of those were basically considerations of barriers. To promote adoption, we did ask them, like, where could we do kind of moving forward? Like, what could we do to like start to overcome these barriers or mitigate them? And then the book, you'll see that the last chapter, like in the epilogue, actually, it goes into like, how do we have this culture of inclusion? So we definitely need opportunities for instructors to recognize what inclusive teaching practices are, to see each other's classes, to have these resources such as this book, so that they can actually conceptualize it and apply it into their classes. And also supportive cultures within their departments and missions, right? Within their departments, to actually think about their curriculum very carefully, and to think about their students very carefully, to actually go into their departments and think about like who's graduating, who's not, who's having trouble, asking students. And I think Khadijah, your department's done some work around this too, but asking students like and getting their feedback to make a more successful experience for all students, right? Within the major or just in general as well. So those are a few strategies. We also talk a little bit about students and their perspectives. So I do a lot of work on student perspectives in the center, and it can be very powerful to hear from students who have been excluded, to have students who haven't had equitable experiences, and to have them share, and also to get feedback in that way. We run an inclusive teaching academy at my school, which has been, you know, really helpful, where students student partners, pedagogical partners pair with faculty members on their inclusive teaching efforts, and they get that feedback. So it's actually really important as well to think about mechanisms for getting feedback also, because sometimes we can reflect on our own biases and things like that. Sometimes we're just not aware of certain things or things that we do in the classroom, and having that feedback I think is also very useful. Let's see. Do we want to move to the Q&A maybe? And feel free, my co-authors, I'm going to actually close the slides here. My co-authors are welcome to also chat or respond in the Q&A, because I know that we have a lot of questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. So I do see a question: how to shift instructor mindset towards supportive ones? Can you give a few examples? I think that's a golden question. I'd love to, you know, kind of know all the answers to how to do that. But what I will say is it is an individual response, and everybody has their own journey. So being aware and actually increasing awareness of thinking about who your students are, I think is one step. The one way that we actually have really seen a lot of that is through the Who's in Class forum and through this whole entire pandemic. During this pandemic, you maybe have this experience as well, but many of our instructors became very aware of inclusion and equity challenges with students because of the nature of what was happening with teaching and what they could see and what they become aware of. So I think the more opportunities we have to show or to see what these students experience, whether from their perspectives, from their feedback, from, you know, our own wanting and desire to be able to engage in this, the more we can shift mindsets.
I would just throw out there as well, Tracie, one of the things that I think is helpful in trying to address this in the book, particularly for those folks who are not sort of actively averse to being inclusive teachers, but maybe just have not realized some of the ways that their course designs aren't maybe achieving those goals. Throughout the book, we have questions, right, at the end of each section, and then we sort of collect them for each chapter for folks to think about as they're going through this, you know, that ask about these different steps in the process as a way for folks to reflect on what they're doing now, how that matches up with some of the things we're talking about in the book, and then hopefully to identify like areas for improvement moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see another question. I agree with the importance of the syllabus, but they can get easily lengthy, so true. And despite info rich, students don't always read them. How do you bring the info from the syllabus to your students without assuming they read it or relying upon a one and done overview the first week? I think both Mallory and Khadijah probably could talk to this, but would Lenny, you'd like to answer that one?
Yeah, I'll chime in real quickly. I think Frank had to leave, but he'll have access to the recording. So this is something we actually talk about in chapter 3, this sort of trade-off between length of syllabus and efforts to explain, you know, how, what, and why. One thing I will say is that as a tone, like setting the tone does not necessarily imply length. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But I do think it's true for most of us, particularly as our institutions maybe require that we put more and more in a syllabus. They can get long. And so we talk about some strategies in the book for distilling the most important information in a syllabus and potentially directing students elsewhere to fill in some of the details. But one of the other strategies that we talk about, and one that I use, is essentially, you know, not just treating the syllabus as a thing you tell students to read or as a thing you maybe talk through the first day of class before they've had time to process anything. But as something that you actually assign as a reading in your own class. And again, getting back to the principle of explaining to students not just what they're doing, but why they're doing it. Explaining to students what a syllabus is, what it contains, why you're asking them to read it, the types of questions you want them to think about as they're reading it, and then actually building space into class to talk about the syllabus the same way you would any other reading. Is one way to try and get around some of the challenges of getting students to engage with, you know, increasingly lengthy syllabus, and getting them to understand what's there and why and how they can use it.
So just to follow up with Mallory just mentioned, I know in the book, but also in practice from colleagues, many people use a syllabus quiz. So it's a low stakes, you know, low point value, but it incentivizes the student to do this, but it also provides this in a more, I guess, fun way. So also trivia, I've seen people use syllabus trivia and take a couple minutes. So it actively helps the students think about the important thing and re-emphasize what's important in a syllabus, right? But it also helps them actively recall what are the important things. So those are two concrete ways that people, independent of length, can actually kind of do a pulse check to see if the students are actually following the syllabus.
Yeah, this year I did a syllabus scavenger hunt, and it was like a small group work scavenger hunt. There were Google Docs that they were using and certain questions they had to fill out, and kind of whichever group was able to get the correct information in the quickest time, they got to choose which date they were presenting their journal club paper on in the class later on. So it wasn't even like a graded assessment, but there was some incentive for them to dig into the syllabus a little bit and find some of those things that I thought were really important.
Great. Yeah, so we'll keep going on these questions. These are really good. Can you give examples of equitable assessment beyond UDL and language and vignettes? So maybe Derek, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, and so chapter 5 does discuss this a bit. I mentioned a little bit things like thinking about the timing of your exam. Like, are you giving a timed exam, and why are you giving a timed exam, right? Is it a goal of your class that they are able to provide this information in a specific amount of time, or is that not a goal, in which case that might change how you think about your exam? But again, exams don't have to be the only type of assessment, right? It depends on class. Sometimes, class size can play a role, but where there's opportunities to show understanding, to show learning, to show skill development in other ways, whether that's, orally or project-based assignments. I think many of our students and ourselves have been forced to become more technologically adept during kind of the COVID pandemic. And some of our students are really great. Some of the ones I've seen are really great at doing audio-visual presentations that show me, yeah, they totally get it and they can apply these skills. So opportunities like that. Now, you might say in a large class, this seems like a lot of work. I can't possibly grade 100 different AV presentations. Well, there are ways to think about this too. You could have kind of a selective grading, a random grading. I've had colleagues that have, had projects where all students submit and then 10 of them are selected at random to be graded that time. And you might get graded kind of at any time during the and that reduces kind of grading load on the faculty a bit. But, thinking about, and there's some data on, the types of questions that you include, if it is an exam, thinking about one thing that I've implemented is student created questions, where the students are actually creating the exam and they're both learning by having to create the question and then answering the questions that other students came up with. So there's lots of different ways to kind of get into assessment in equitable and inclusive manner. And yeah, some more details provided in chapter 5 of the book.
Great, thank you. Just skimming the questions a bit. The who's in class form, absolutely. Just email, you can email me, you can email Derek, email Khadijah, and just ask us for the form. We are happy to provide it. The form is constructed in collaboration also in thinking about like a teaching center or somebody on your campus that thinks about teaching in different ways. Even if you don't have a Center for Teaching and Learning, because we understand not all institutions have them. But you can feel free to email us and we'd like to copy that person. We do like to be able to share it with that person as well. I do see a question about the large classes. So what strategies do we feel are particularly effective without being burdensome? So could any of my co-authors share some strategies?
I can speak to that. So I teach large introductory STEM courses. And one of the things that we saw in the text, other inclusive instructors, the who's in class form actually is a really great tool that can help you, in particularly with this question. So what I can tell you what I do in my classroom. So I have about 120 students in a class right now. And I take that form and I distill the information across all students and I give it back to them as a presentation so they can see how many of the students in the class, and it's completely anonymous. But what I do then, I go say how I change the course, whether it's the content or the assessments, to reflect that diversity that's in the room. And so that's one way that I'm not going one-on-one with hundreds of students, but they see that every single attribute that they're bringing to the classroom is helpful in them being involved with that and then tweaking it. So definitely the who's in class form can help with.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Some of my colleagues think icebreakers are integral to inclusive classrooms. I've never seen any data on whether students actually find them helpful or welcoming. What are your thoughts? I think that's a good question. I will say that definitely during the pandemic, the check-in kind of icebreakers, I think, have been really helpful for students. In fact, we have student fellows again for my center, and we ask them their feedback on these things. And we ask them also to create resources or give their perspectives. And one of the things they did say were the check-ins. So thinking about like, how do you feel right now, you know, or like a poll and things like that. They really like that at the beginning of class, or when the instructor actually devoted some time to that, especially during this very challenging time. So I think it depends probably on the class, on the class and why how you're doing it, or what you're doing the icebreaker on. But I would definitely say right now, those have been definitely told by us, by our students, that they really like them. Anyone else want to add any more?
I'll just note that I appreciate all of the attendees that are sharing information in the chat as well. There's been some great links and resources provided to some of these questions. And again, this gets at, you know, we as a group don't look at ourselves as the authors, as the experts here, but we look at the community as the experts and what we can learn. So I really appreciate those shares. Again, there's some links on icebreakers. I know there was one up above about different inclusive active learning strategies and things like that. So thank you so much for adding those here.
Absolutely. And I believe Stylus will be sharing the chat as well, or some of the resources in the chat. And maybe Stylus can comment upon that as well. I did see a question in the chat around the equity index, and we did not ask the instructors to complete some kind of equity index, but that would have been really nice. I agree that having some kind of measurement would be useful, maybe as kind of a next step for this work as well. So absolutely a good point that was raised there. All right, I know we only have about 2 more minutes left, and I know you have a lot of great questions to ask as well. Let's see. Let's go to the next question. In fields where belonging, let's see if we can answer this one. Fields where belonging is hard to demonstrate because it's been dominated by specific social identities. Did you all discover effective practices that instructors have adopted to encourage students to stick around? Anyone like to talk through that?
I'll chime in real quickly with this because, you know, one of the answers to this question has to do with building a syllabus. And so one of the things we talk about in chapter 3 are the challenges, particularly when we're thinking about making people feel a sense of belonging in the field by demonstrating sort of a diverse set of people who contribute to the body of knowledge in that field. And that is obviously more challenging in some fields than it is in others. So we point to a few resources in the text, notably things like professional associations, external sort of aggregators in some fields that are trying to put together sort of work from women in the field or from scholars of color in the field. We talk about using social media as a good way to curate sort of more diverse material in the field. And then we also talk a little bit about how, you know, if you're constrained in some way because either you know, there is not as much material in a field by sort of more diverse voices, though I would say that we often overthink that. We think that is the case more often than it actually is. And so some exploration can help us sort of flesh out maybe our knowledge of scholars in our field. But one of the ways that can often be constrained is particularly in, I think, STEM courses, like if you're using a shared textbook and you just actually don't have that much control over the material you're using in your class. We talk about other ways to incorporate examples and media throughout the course that are highlighting these gaps that perhaps you're not fitting with your reading. So we do talk about some strategies in the book to address that.
Great. And Patty, I know we're near time, so I want to get a heads up from you if we should start concluding.
Hi, everyone. We can go on a little bit longer if all of our panelists are okay with staying an extra 10 to 15 minutes. We're good with that. The replay will include all of those questions at the end. So if any of our attendees need to go because they're at time, that's fine. You'll still get answers to those questions in the replay.
Great. So I think everybody can stay for a few more minutes, answer a few more questions. Okay, thank you. So let's go to this next question. So recent research and reporting has suggested that most colleges assert that diversity provides compelling educational benefits and is thus instrumentally useful. The researchers found that this argument aligns with the preferences of white Americans, whereas Black Americans prefer moral or values-based motivations for advancing diversity and inclusion. Furthermore, moral motivations appear to have a more positive impact on access, belonging, and success for BIPOC students. What rationales, instrumental, moral, both other, motivate the faculty in your study to promote inclusion? Wow, that's a good question. I think we'll have to think about that for a minute. But if any of my co-authors want to jump in.
Well, I mean, the short answer is for our study as a whole, we probably don't really know that answer. We did ask some questions that gave us some insight into a little bit of the why, but by and large, we don't totally have the answer to the exact motivation for the faculty along those lines that were participating in our study.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to if we could follow up, do more, kind of focus groups or, kind of see that. But I think you're right, Derek, those types of questions probably would require more in-depth analysis, which is definitely, important and something that could be done for sure.
I do think it comes out a little bit in the language that that instructors use in the survey some of the time. So you'll see some folks talking about strategies as in sort of normative ways, right? I do this because it is a normatively good thing to do. And I think that maps onto the sort of moral justifications more. And you see some instructors talk about strategies they use because they think they're going to get a better outcome, right? People are going to perform better. People are more likely to, students are, more likely to participate or more likely to do well on assessments, which I think maps on a little bit more to the instrumental. So I don't think folks are using the specific language of those motivations in the survey, but you can intuit some of that, I think, in the responses that people give.
Great point, Mallory. So I appreciate very much that the book seems to focus on prevention versus intervention. That said, the themes emerge regarding effective interruption management strategies when things did go awry. Yeah, so awry, I guess that should be. So Khadijah, that would be, I think, an area that you could speak to for sure.
Sure. So, Chris, actually, we have a section of the book, and particularly in chapter 4, where we talk about what happens when the welcome environment is disruptive, and if it's disrupted by the instructor or the student, and what are strategies that we can use together to actually mitigate that, right? So I think definitely there are concrete things you could there's concrete strategies. There's actually even a tool you can use to help you restore that that balance, right, in that welcome day.
Okay. I suspect many instructors are applying at least some inclusive practices without knowing that's what they are. Yes, absolutely. Is there a list of examples of inclusive practices that could be provided to faculty to better understand their own teaching?
So I can just jump in briefly. So chapter 5 does go through this and kind of list, but also explain a lot of those that are useful and provide references and resources to where they've been implemented. Is there data to support that they actually are inclusive and things like that? But I just put in the chat, I didn't know if it had gone out to everyone before, but Barbara Richardson had shared a resource called liberatingstructures.com. So I haven't looked at that one myself other than a brief glance just a couple minutes ago once it was shared. But there are some resources online available that kind of talk about these active learning strategies. Again, some things that we talk about in chapter 5 are case studies, problem-based learning, classroom jigsaws, debates, interactive lectures, using things like Socrative and poll everywhere and things like that. If you're in an online version or even in person, they can be applied. POGIL, think, pair, share, serious gaming, and the list goes on. But there is a decent amount of data that supports some of these, and also there needs to be a push to do more of these studies and to learn more about what's working and what isn't. So if you're doing something in your own classes, think about publishing and sharing that information, because it can be really useful to the community at large.
I would just add, getting back to the idea of sort of using the book as a diagnostic tool to figure out like what inclusive practices we're doing and not doing. Again, I would refer folks to the questions that are sort of incorporated throughout the text and then aggregated at the end in an appendix. If someone is interested in trying to figure out, whether they or perhaps their colleagues are already doing some of these inclusive practices, going through that Q&A would be a really good way to do that, because it's essentially asking like, are you doing this thing? And then you can go back and say, okay, well, if not, let me see what the discussion is in the book about this particular question. So I would encourage thinking about that as a way to try and identify what you're doing, what you're not, and then to get some more information on the parts that you want to sort of work on.
Mm-hmm. Great. So Hannah asked, did you gather any student stories and testimonials or match up students' insights with what their instructors were saying? That's a great question, Hannah. This study wasn't designed in that way, but there is a lot of value to actually using student stories. And I know that my co-authors and I have talked about that, because this book is really focused on the perspectives of instructors, but we really do want to know the perspectives of students, right, as well. Some of the ways that it gets into the kind of what the students are thinking and whatnot is that I would recommend that instructors do mid-course feedback and include questions around the inclusive environment in it. And that's really, I think, helpful. For our Inclusive Instructors Academy faculty members, they've been doing that, and their student partners will actually work with them on that feedback. And, it's really helpful, and it's more actionable also if it's, informative in that type of way. But I think student stories and testimonials is a great avenue for future work in this, because it is important to think about both parties. The students are experiencing inclusion, right, or experiencing an equitable classroom. So we really do want to hear their perspective. So thank you for sharing that. And I think Derek wants to say something.
And as Tracie mentioned earlier, one of the aspects that we did actually get substantive student feedback on is that who's in class form.
Yes.
So we did look there, and that again is a paper that is in review currently, but hopefully will be coming out, and kind of saw some student feedback on that, as well as instructor feedback.
Yeah, and in that article, the data that we collected on feedback, the majority of the students were very happy that their instructor used the form. It was a high number of students, of all the hundreds that were surveyed. Okay, I knew we were going to start, so maybe one more. So did any of the participants mention the barrier of department design classes? I'm able to be much more inclusive in my elective courses, but much less in my intro major sections, where I'm tied to group decisions about content and exams. So let me think. I'm trying to think if anybody actually specific called out their departments. What we did see in the study in general is that they didn't feel supported necessarily by their department. So we did ask them, how supported were you by your institution, by your department, et cetera. And so there were some lower scores in those regards, but not everybody, but definitely it came out there, the department, kind of as thinking about at the level of the department. I'm trying to think if there were any other structures they were worried about. I think a little bit it came out, maybe like the content that they had to teach, that came out as a barrier. I have to teach this content, etc. As well. Can others think of any other ways that came out in the study?
I was just going to say, I think it came up occasionally more frequently in the form of resources.
Yeah,
than some of the course content barriers. Mm-hmm. But I would just reiterate once again, with respect to some of the course content barriers, that is something we talk a little bit about in the book, and some workarounds for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say I think many of us can appreciate those challenges of courses that we don't have full ownership of for one reason or another. But I think that one thing you can do is you can be an advocate, of course, for moving towards more inclusive strategies. And that's a great thing. And, starting that conversation, it may take, a number of iterations of that class being implemented to get where you exactly want it to be. But I recommend being an advocate. The other thing to keep in mind is that even if you don't have full control over content and assessments, like, what text you're using or what assessment, you do still have control in your classroom to some degree, and using things like the Who's in Class forum and setting that tone and doing all those things Khadijah mentioned about, being welcoming before the class, in the beginning of the class, and throughout the class can be ways that inclusivity is really engendered within your course.
I have one final thought to carry over to what Derek just mentioned. So I do teach a course that we have the same text and we cover the same content, but I think one way that you can infuse it, like Derek mentioned, in your actual class. So for example, we all talk about Darwin. And so this year what I did was, because in my classroom I had more racial and ethnic diversity, as well as a mix between students identified as male and female, I was able to, for example, infuse Darwin's original letters, and we had a discussion about racism and sexism. So it wasn't that we just totally dismissed what Darwin had said, but there was a way that we could take what we knew about, like the students from this example is the Who's in Class form, and tweak and modify some things. So you may not be able to take assessments, but at least you would be able to supplement that and have maybe some time and discussion in the class to address those things.
Yeah, and I would just add one more thing about the assessment question in particular, right? If you may not have control over the substance or format of assessments, but you do have control over how you're preparing students for those. And so if we're thinking about the broader questions of course design and this idea of telling students not only what they're doing, but how to do that successfully and why you're asking them, right? You do have the ability to direct students to resources, to be as clear as possible about what the assessment is going to be, and to explain like why it is set up the way it does, or the way it is, and prepare them for it. So I think that is, all of those are part and parcel of promoting equity, right, in the classroom.
Great. Well, thank you all. And I wish we could get to all of your questions, but what I will say is feel free to contact us to ask us more questions. We're happy to hear from you as well. And thank you so much for your engagement today in the webinar. It's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you about the book, about some of the things in the book, and to hear some of the questions that you are thinking about, right, with regards to inclusion, and to start those conversations. So thank you all.
Thank you to Tracie, Derek, Khadijah, and Mallory for sharing their time and presenting this webinar opportunity with us. And thank you to everyone who tuned in live with us this afternoon. If you are interested in ordering What Inclusive Instructors Do, use code INCL20 to get 20% off the book and free shipping from Stylus Publishing. And I will share that link in the book page. I will share the link to the book page in the chat bar. The video replay will be available tomorrow or Friday and shared on all of our Stylus social media feeds. The webinar chat log will also be saved and emailed to everyone who registered as well. If you have any feedback on this webinar or any requests for future webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylusinfo@styluspub.com. All of the author's contact information will also be shared in that follow-up email as well. So thanks again and have a great afternoon.